Good evening, everybody. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to today's event. My name is Holger Klein. I'm currently serving as the director of the Sakib Sabanci Center. And this is indeed the first event of the academic year for us, so it's an opener in many ways. And before I pass the podium on to my colleague Tunç, I would like to introduce you to some new faces at the Sakib Sabanci Center. And I would like to start with Dr. Sümeyye Yar. Sümeyye, would you mind to stand up? Sümeyye is the new Associate Director of the Sakib Sabanci Center. And she is an alumna of the Sabanci University, where she majored in biological sciences and bioengineering. And after moving to the United States, she received her MS in biotechnology at Rush University and a PhD in biochemistry and molecular genetics from the University of Illinois at Chicago. Following her postdoctoral fellowship at Northwestern University, she also had a position as a scientific consultant at Biotech Without Borders here in New York. And she comes to Columbia University and to the Sakib Sabanci Center, therefore with extensive experience in program management, educational outreach, grants administration, and event organization, all of the things that we desperately need and didn't have. So Sümeyye, welcome to this position, and she will become a familiar face to everybody who visits our events regularly. I would also like to introduce you to Dr. Meriç Tanek, who joins Meriç, would you mind to just stand up? Thank you. Who is our postdoctoral research fellow this year. And Dr. Tanek received her PhD in history earlier this year from the EHESS in Paris, after receiving her BA and MA degrees in history from the University of Paris, Panthéon-Sorbonne, and she has taught undergraduate history and language courses at Sciences Po at the Reims campus, and also at the Institut National des Langues et Civilisations Orientales, and graduate courses at the EHESS in Paris. Please help me to give both Dr. Yar and Dr. Tanek a warm welcome to Columbia and to the Sakib Sabanci Center. And now, without further ado, let me hand the podium over to Tunç, who is well known to all of you as the History Department's resident specialist on the history of the Ottoman Empire, and within this broader field as a social and cultural historian of intellectual practices. He will now introduce you to our program tonight and its main protagonists. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Klein, for this warm introduction, and thank you all for being with us today. Before I introduce our speakers, let me briefly explain our format for those of you who may not be familiar with our New Books in Turkish Studies series that we initiated a few years ago in our center. We will begin with Professor Edhem Eldem, who will provide an overview of his most recent work that we will have a discussion on today. And this will be followed by commentary and questions from each of our respondents, Professor Abigail Balbale and Dr. Iheb Guermazi. And afterward, we will open the floor to a Q&A session. Please note that today's panel will be recorded and made available on our center's YouTube channel in about 2 weeks. So any questions you may pose during the Q&A will also be recorded. I would also like to invite everyone to the reception we will hold after the panel, not here, but in the lounge across the hall on this floor. Our staff will be available to guide those who may need assistance finding the location, but it's pretty easy to find. So We are so fortunate to have Professor Edhem Eldem with us, not just for today, but also for the entire academic year as our center's Sakıp Sabancı visiting professor. Professor Eldem, a distinguished historian of the Ottoman Empire, has taught for over 3 decades at the Department of History at Boğaziçi University. He also had visiting professorships at numerous prestigious universities, including Berkeley, Harvard, École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, École Pratique des Hautes Études, École Normale Supérieure, and Columbia. Professor Eldem has also held the International Chair of Turkish and Ottoman Studies at the Collège de France, and he has been a fellow at the Wissenschaftskolleg zu Berlin. Among his various fields of interest are the Levant trade in the 18th century, Ottoman funerary epigraphy, the development of an urban bourgeoisie in Istanbul, the history of the Imperial Ottoman Bank, the history of archaeology in the Ottoman Empire, the history of photography, late 19th century Ottoman first-person narratives and biographies, Westernization and the Tanzimat, and Orientalism. His wide range of publications include French trade in Istanbul in the 18th century, a history of the Ottoman Bank, the Ottoman city between East and West, Aleppo, Izmir, and Istanbul, published together with Daniel Goffman and Bruce Masters, history of Ottoman orders, medals, and decorations, death in Istanbul, consuming the Orient, un Ottoman en Orient, Osman Hamdi Bey en Irak, Le Voyage en Nemrut Dağı de Osman Hamdi Bey, Oskan Efendi, Scramble for the Past, a story of archaeology in the Ottoman Empire, published together with Zeynep Bahrani, who is with us today, and Zeynep Çelik. Camera Ottomana, photography and modernity in the Ottoman Empire, again together with Zeynep Çelik. L'Alhambra, à la croisée des histoires, and finally l'Empire Ottoman. Joining him are 2 distinguished colleagues, Professor Abigail Balbale, who is an associate professor in the departments of Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies and History at New York University. Her research focuses on the Islamic West in the medieval period, with a particular interest in comparing written sources and material culture. Her prize-winning book, The Wolfgang Ibn Mardanish and the Construction of Power in Al-Andalus, was published by Cornell University Press 2 years ago. And she is currently working on a book entitled Al-Andalus, A History of Islamic Spain in 50 Objects and Spaces, that focuses on both the material culture of Al-Andalus and its memory up to the present. And this book is under contract with Princeton University Press. Our second respondent is Dr. Iheb Guermazi, who is a Mellon postdoctoral fellow in the Society of Fellows and Heyman Center for the Humanities at Columbia University. Dr. Guermazi is an architect, curator, and architectural historian. He is interested in the intersection between art, architecture, and modern Sufi discourses. Dr. Guermazi received a PhD in the history, theory, and criticism of architecture and art from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he was also affiliated with the Aga Khan program for Islamic architecture. His current book project, tentatively titled Mystics, Rebels, and Artists on the Birth of a Sufi Art Theory, traces the history of a group of Muslim Sufi mystics and European converts to Islam, writing in the late 19th and early mid-20th century, who developed an anti-Western art theory with novel conceptions of tradition, beauty, authorship, and time. So without further ado, let me invite Professor Edhem Eldem to the podium.
Thank you so much. Welcome to my roast, as they say. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank the organizers, the Sabanje Center, of course, Tunç, Holger, and the two respondents to my book, Abigail and Iheb, for having accepted this task of, first of all, reading the book in order to comment on it. Now, given that I have only 15 minutes, I have to be disciplined. Those who know me know that 15 minutes for me is nothing, my students especially. So I will have to discipline myself, and to do so, I've reduced my presentation to basically three topics, in fact, three questions. Why, how, and I think the question that we all have to ask at the end of a project, so what? So this is a project, the why, I'm starting with the why. This is a project, I cheated a little bit because it's a new book in the sense that it was published at the EUP, the Edinburgh University Press this year. But actually it's a translation of a book I published in 2021 at Les Belles Lettres in Paris. I translated it myself, which is an ordeal and yet an interesting exercise because you find all sorts of things you can revise. So it's a project that has been going on for over 10 years now. And it's a project, we can talk later about the difference between the two covers, French and British. I think there's a lot to say about the choices that were made by the publishers. So this project was triggered by curiosity, which itself was triggered by an incongruous photograph that a friend of mine had in her family papers, the one on the left, which was strangely familiar, and strangely familiar, especially to somebody who's working on Osman Hamdi, and you can see a self-portrait of Osman Hamdi Bey on the right. You can see where I see similarities, and yet it was weird. That's a very powerful word that is being used today, but I think it deserves this appellation. Weird because the idea of seeing what was evidently an Arab alim, a scholar, in a very Andalusian, in fact, you can immediately identify it as the Alhambra setting, is something you don't expect to see. Because if you work on Orientalism, be it Western Orientalism or even Modern Orientalism, you rarely have this kind of a conjunction of two elements of authenticity, but so far apart. So for me, the challenge was to read, as they say, this image. Read this image, and for that I have to make a very truthful mea culpa, because my first reaction was immediately to believe what he said on the back of the photo and take him at face value and say and accept that this was a corner of the Alhambra. But it took an art historian who is here, yes, Avinoam Shalem, who said in not so many words, "You're completely stupid, you didn't understand that this is not the Alhambra, it's a studio, it's a photographer's studio. Look at the chimneys on top and whatever." And he was right, of course, and that was kind of sobering to somebody who constantly criticizes art historians for over-reading images. This was a sobering kind of slap in the face, and I'm thankful for it, because it opened one of the most fascinating avenues into my reading of the image, because I suddenly discovered that this studio, this mock Andalusian or Alhambresque studio, was in fact very popular at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century. It was the photographic studio of a photographer, a local photographer in Granada, Rafael Garzón, who had his studio right next to the Alhambra and used it to lure in tourists who wanted to have a portrait taken in Oriental garb. And therefore, the incongruity of seeing a real Arab, a true Arab, in a fake Alhambra was even more heightened by this discovery I made of these strange circumstances of the photographic studio of Rafael Garzón. Now, the back of the photograph, that is the inscription, which was half Turkish because it was addressed to a Turkish colleague, and by Turkish I'm going to use Turkish, and this is something I never do when I talk about Ottomans, but in this case I will, because I'm referring to their cultural and linguistic skills, and it's important in this context because they're clueless when it comes to things Arab. It was addressed to a Turk, so the address itself, the dedication, was in Turkish. But then he said, and I left this poem, 6 verses, in the visitor's book of the Alhambra. So that was the other epiphany, the textual epiphany, the kind of epiphany I'm more used to, being more of a textual person. And I discovered that ever since 1829, that is the date when Prince Dolgorouki, who was a travel companion to Washington Irving in 1829, visiting the Alhambra, decided to gift the Alhambra administration with a visitor's book, a book that would be open to all visitors where they could sign and leave comments. And this book is fascinating because it's an uninterrupted series of such comments, thousands and thousands of pages from 1829 to the present. And they're online. It's incredible. They're online. The Patronato de la Alhambra has it online. So I immediately had access. Of course, I wanted to find my guy because, I wanted to prove that he had been there. And just to give you an idea, the page, this random page from the visitor's book, gives you a sense of how diverse the entries are. You have some, like the one at the bottom, Victor Place, whom archaeologists or historians of archaeology will know as the successor to Botta in the Mesopotamian excavations, who defines himself as a flâneur parisien, a Parisian flâneur. Very laconical, but so powerful. And then you have this long description by these British tourists of the higher echelons of society who tell the story of how they dance the waltz and the polka in the Alhambra to the astonishment of many and whatever. So pages and pages of this this coming and going between laconical signatures and dates and comments, and sometimes comments replying to comments read. So it's very political, especially when you have one Frenchman and one Spaniard on the same page. It's like hell. It's fascinating. But of course, my interest was for my guy, who, by the way, is a Khalidi. For those of you who know Rashid Khalidi at the history department, he's a great uncle of Rashid Khalidi. He's a Maqdisi, he's from Quds, from Jerusalem, a Palestinian family of scholars, and he indeed left a trace in the visitor's book, which I've circled on the left, with the little poem he said he had inscribed, with the only difference that it's a different poem. But, that happens. But this was, for me, the discovery of many more such weird signatures. I mean, we all know that the Alhambra is the Mecca of Western tourism. So we don't expect to find outsiders there. And yet there are many. And of course, the advantage I had was they were easy to spot because of the script. I did some profiling, if you want, on the basis of the script, which made my job very easy because all the weird scripts, and especially the Arabic script, is easy to catch. I always say that I pity my Belgian colleague who would want to do something on Belgian tourists at the Alhambra. Good luck with that. How are you going to spot them without reading those thousands of pages? So this led to the discovery, and this looks very serious and statistical. The little dots represent individuals that I spotted. I put them in under 5 categories. The Turks, again, insisting on the cultural and linguistic reference. Ottoman non-Muslims, mostly Greeks and Armenians. Jews are very difficult to spot for the simple reason that most of them sign or write in French. That's what acculturation after the Alliance Israélite Universelle does to that community. Then Christian Arabs, and I singled them from the non-Muslims because they are Arab-speaking and Arab-writing individuals, mostly Maronites, and Muslim Arabs from the Mashreq, so Levantines, if you want, from Egypt, from Lebanon, from Syria, and finally the Maghrebis. And you can see that the Maghrebis, who are in 90% of the cases Moroccans, are overwhelmingly present in the visitors book. Overall, I had something like 250 individuals, which is a nice sample. And I like samples. I like repetition. I like counting my beads. So it was really, and I have to say it was a project that I enjoyed so much. I had so much fun doing because it brought together the quantitative with the qualitative, with the images, in some kind of a discovery of a very, very strange, very unexpected environment. So those are the whys. How, as I said, this is a little bit too early. The how is really about how do you treat this kind of a sample? How do you process such textual information and try to make sense of it in terms of the long 19th century, 1829, and I went as far as the end of World War I, so I had practically a century of visits. So what I did was rather simple. I had my 5 categories, and I came up with very basic differences between these 5 groups. The Maghrebis, who are obviously the most interesting because of the proximity, both geographic but also cultural, with Andalusia, they're the hardest to understand because their inscriptions are very short, laconical, a name, a date, no comments, no feelings. And interestingly, the Spaniards, especially the Spanish press, the Granada press, is so ready to hear them lament and sigh, the sigh of the Moor, that they, in a sense, complement this void of feelings and sentiments by providing them with a voice. So it's a very interesting combination of local Spanish visions of how these people should react to the site of the Alhambra and others and their own silence. The Turks are extremely interesting, much more familiar to me because they fall into that strange, westernized, orientalist category of people who travel to Spain with European sources, French sources, and towards the end of the century or beginning of the 20th century, I have spotted them all with the Baedeker, the famous little red book, guidebook, in their hands, and that's how they visit this foreign land, knowing that it is part of some heritage, but in fact not understanding it because they don't have access to the language and to the culture. the non-Muslim Ottomans, Greeks and Armenians, there are too few of them to be able to say anything, but their reaction is generally a reaction very similar to that of the Europeans. I mean, they go there as they would visit something that has to be visited by European standards. There are interesting, one Greek, Kara Theodori, for example, will compare it to the Acropolis in Athens. So there is always, a little sentiment of national pride. The Maronites, the Christian Arabs, are completely off in a sense because they visited, and you understand they visited because it's part of a network they have, a Catholic network they have with very Catholic Spain. So it's Lebanon linked to Spain, and you understand that they're there for business, for alms, for money that they use to fund their schools in Lebanon, in Mount Lebanon, but they visited because it's something you have to do. So it's very, and of course the most fascinating are the Levantine Arabs, the Mashreqis, who know exactly, they're latecomers, they appear only in the 1890s, but they come with a vengeance, that is, with the nahda. They come with the knowledge or the idea that this is a representation of their past glory and that it is therefore a future, a realization of their future hopes of breaking away from Ottoman rule, but especially from British rule in the case of the Egyptians. So finally, so what? So what? First, obviously, for somebody who's worked so much on Ottoman Orientalism, it is a refreshing take on this because it's different from the Ottoman Orientalist at home. It is the Ottoman Orientalist visiting another Orient and therefore adapting his or her knowledge of the that world filtered through the European sources. So this is true of Tunalı Hilmi, for example, a very well-known young Turk, a very politically active young Turk, who will, and it's the same studio as Khalidi, right? It's Garthon's studio. It's a fascinating pair of images where once he poses as a globetrotter with, and the photograph is so good that I was able to make up the detail of the guidebook he was holding in hand. It's the Baedeker. And the other one, he poses as Chorrojumo, who is this gitano, this Gypsy Roma character that haunted the Alhambra. So you can see that he is not looking for an Orient, he's looking for exoticism with a Spanish sauce. And this is true, of course, of Sami Pashazadeh Sezaibe, who was ambassador in Madrid and who poses in the courtyard of the Lions with a hat, which is very exceptional for Ottomans, and with his very super westernized look, to paraphrase Sherif Mardin. The second thing I would take from this work is that it is a challenge to carry the Ottoman gaze outside of the Ottoman Empire, and thus to break a little bit some of the limits that seem to be imposed on Ottoman history by widening up to the Mediterranean through Andalusia. Third point I would make, it is the conjunction and the embeddedness of several Orientalisms. Western Orientalism, which is really at the center of the Alhambra and the Alhambresque and the Moresque and whatever, but also Ottoman Orientalism, and in between Spanish Orientalism. The way in which the Spaniards are both Orientalized by the Northerners, but they too develop their own Orientalism, especially after 1869, after the War of the Rif, that opens up ambitions of colonialism in Morocco. It is also, fourth point, it was an occasion to break away from the overtrodden paths of the Alhambra and of Andalusia in the wake of Owen Jones and Chateaubriand and Washington Irving. So it was an interesting way to use the techniques of histoire croisée, entangled histories, connected histories, to try to make sense of the complexity of this environment. And of course, I think I came out of this with the discovery of what I still consider to be one of the most incredible sources for the history of tourism, these visitors' books, and I am truly surprised that nobody should have used them to this day. I know there are difficulties, but it's also something that is so tempting for the reasons I said. The conversations you find there, some comments such as the Spaniard who in 1899 cries out, "Señor, que nos reconquisten los árabes." My Lord, may the Arabs reconquer us. It's fantastic. So there's a whole subtext there that is, I think, worth analyzing. And finally, the sobering realization that however much one opens up the 19th century cultural history to the non-West, call it whatever you want, Orientalism keeps popping up in a multitude of layered and embedded forms. So at the end of the day, there is still Orientalism. Orientalism is still the dominant leitmotif behind this, and that gives you a sense of the power of the West in the 19th century. I think I've exceeded by 5 minutes, and I'm sorry for that. Thank you.
Professor Eldem, I'll like to invite our respondents to the podium.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for such a wonderful, rich book. As you've just heard, it offers a micro-historical approach by focusing on the monument of the Alhambra, and not in its moment of construction, not even in later use as a Christian palace, but instead in this long 19th century, and the various people who passed through its walls. Eldem does this through this incredible source that has been entirely unexploited before him, which is the guest book that begins in 1829 and continues. I actually wanted to ask, this is one of my questions, does it continue past 1920?
It does. It's not accessible online.
Okay.
So, but it's accessible until the 1940s.
Amazing. I mean, just thinking about the singular object, singular in all of its senses, right? It's one book that has all of these.
It's a series. It's volumes of,
But this one collection that all of these people have passed through. In some ways, it's like a synecdoche of the entire monument itself. And the reason that this is such a rich book is because the Alhambra carries so many rich meanings for so many people who pass through its doors. I was keeping a little list of some of the meanings of the Alhambra in the book, and it can stand for the Orient, it can stand for Europe, it can stand for modernity, it can stand for the past, it can stand for a lost paradise, it can stand for a peak of civilization, it can stand as a symbol of a decline of the West or a symbol of the decline of the East. It can offer a different future for the Arab or Ottoman worlds. It can stand as a way of laying claim to new territories, like the Spanish do. They use the memory of Al-Andalus to support their colonial project in Morocco. Or it can stand as a way of denigrating the Germans, as various European pavilions at world fairs use Alhambresque architecture to demonstrate the backwardness of the Gothic, which is being used in German pavilions. It can be a way of denigrating the Spanish because they had this incredible civilization and then they've destroyed it and kicked out those who who supported it, who constructed it. It can serve as a way of lamenting modernity and mechanization and the end of cultures of work with the hands, as Owen Jones does. So as you can see, it supports many, many meanings, and several of them are directly contradictory. It can be almost anything, almost anyone. And this book, this guest book, showcases several of these meanings, not just through the individual signatures or passages of individuals who pass through it, but also in conversations. And this is the part that I found most exciting about this guest book, where Edhem just told us about a person who writes, may the Moors reconquer us. And somebody responds to that and says, what are you saying, you crazy person? We don't want those barbarians to reconquer us. They were barbarians when they arrived, and they were barbarians when they left. And we are if there's anything good about the Alhambra, it comes from us Spanish, right? And then somebody responds to that person. So there's conversations that are taking place across time among people who are reading each other's words. And in some ways, this is more parallel to the carved graffiti we find on monuments across the Middle East and North Africa by European tourists and others who in many ways try to imprint themselves and their presence on the monument itself. And actually in the book, the initiation of this guest book is created. I mean, this guest book is donated to the Alhambra precisely because visitors are scratching their names into the walls of the Alhambra, and the prince who donates it hopes that this book will mean that they will write their names someplace other than the walls of the Alhambra. So it's this incredibly rich source, and it allows Eldem to see people who would otherwise be invisible. There have been a number of books that look at travelers to the Alhambra in the 19th century, but they mostly focus, and the 20th century, and they mostly focus on these travelogues, Arabic sources that are rihla narratives, or European travelers' writings about their travels. But these sources are quite limited because they tend to be the ones that are published, and therefore they are the sources written by the elite and the educated. And what this incredible guest book allows is seeing the people who accompany a diplomatic mission, seeing the names of the people who are photographed in the Alhambra who we might otherwise not know. And of course, not everybody's identifiable, the names of the people who signed this book, but it gives a different perspective than any of the other sources that have examined this period and examined tourists and travelers to the Alhambra. And what it shows is that there's this gap in the travel narratives, and it shows that there was actually considerable Arab and Ottoman visitors to the Alhambra, even in this period where there are no travelogues and no narratives written by them. So there's more or less continuous visitors from across the Arab and Muslim worlds. What Edhem does is compare this source to all of the other kinds of sources, including the rihla narratives, including the works of Washington Irving, including photographs and paintings, as you have seen, to offer a really rich perspective, not just on how visitors saw the Alhambra, but also how people saw them seeing the Alhambra. And this is a really, really fascinating and exciting piece of this book, because Spanish journalists accompanying a group of Moroccans to the Alhambra seem to always describe them as being wistful, as sighing, as tearing up. And Edhem shows that there's no evidence of this in the photographs, in the writings of these visitors in this early period. There's no affective component of their own writings or depictions of the Alhambra. And so it raises this really fascinating question of why are Spanish scholars, Spanish journalists, Spanish observers invested in this affect of despair for Muslim visitors, for Moroccan visitors in particular. And of course, this ties into the idea of the Moor's last sigh, the figure of Boabdil, the last Muslim king of Granada, who is described as going up to the mountain pass after surrendering the city to Ferdinand and Isabella, turning around, looking at the Alhambra and sighing, and having his mother respond, "Don't sigh like a woman for what you were unable to defend like a man," right? It's this very, there's no evidence of this in early Arabic sources. This is a romantic invention, and the figure of Boabdil holds far greater space in historical memory than he does in history itself. But this idea that Muslims should come in and sigh looking at the Alhambra, this reenactment of Boabdil's response, is really fascinating. And it's particularly fascinating because Edhem shows how over time this becomes the response of Muslim and Arab visitors. That is perhaps mediated by these Western sources that talk about a lost paradise. They too begin to talk about a lost paradise, especially in the period of the Nahda in the early 20th century, in both Arab and Ottoman contexts. Figures begin to start talking about what was lost. Al-Firdaus al-Mafqud, like al-Mafqud, this lost paradise that has been that represents a peak of Islamic civilization or Arab civilization, and that is to be wept over. And this is not present in the earlier periods. So we see this change over time. And one of the questions I'd like to get to with you is how that change happens. You talk about it in terms of imperialism and the end of the decline of the Ottoman Empire and all of these. I'd like to talk more about how this happens. But there's this fixation on affect that then becomes a broader way of engaging with the monument. So the ways in which the Alhambra becomes a tragic figure, like Boabdil himself, like this last remnant, this relic of a wonderful lost paradise. So figures like Shakib Arslan use the Alhambra to lay claim to a future in which Arabs can have great civilization like they once did, and they can be just as advanced as Europeans because they once were Europeans. Of course, the idea of Europe and the Middle East are much later inventions than the creation of this building. So there's a reorientation of the meanings of the Alhambra to stake a claim among Muslims and Arabs to an advanced civilization and to Europe. And the superficiality of early Ottoman perspectives on the Alhambra, what you call a copy-paste approach, taking the architecture of the Alhambra and redeploying it in Ottoman context, is then replaced as a moribund empire starts to mobilize the Alhambra as a symbol of a great period of Islamic civilization, a lost paradise, a counterpoint to European imperialism. How am I doing on time? Yeah. Okay. Mainly what I have left are questions, so I can wrap up here. I just want to point out, I don't know if you have seen this, but there are still photography studios next to the Alhambra where people can get dressed in Eastern garb and have their photos taken next to models of the Alhambra.
I have a photograph of that in the book, the last photograph.
Oh,
and okay. I've checked, and from the tiling, I know it's Garzons.
The same one, yeah.
It's Garzons remodeled, but it's the same.
Yeah, yeah.
It's fascinating, yes.
Okay, so I will wrap up there, and then I'll ask you some questions.
All right. First of all, I will make sure to stay on time, I hope, because I have a lot of notes, simply because I actually enjoyed reading this very much. Such an enjoyable read, beautifully written and argued. First, of course, the clarity of the book's scope, I have to say, and the argument. This is, after all, a book about one monument, the Alhambra, and one group of people, namely those who visited Alhambra between the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century and wrote something in the visitor's book. adds to the clarity of the scope and the argument of this sort of microhistory of modern Alhambra is, I'd say, also the structure of the book. One could say the sort of a cardinal organization of the book around northeast and south, where Alhambra is some form of a cosmic center of the world. In each chapter, in fact, we are looking at one community of visitors, whether they are coming from the north, there's Spain and Europe, or south from the Maghreb region, which is actually a community of visitors that has often been occulted from narratives around the Alhambra in general. Or finally from the east, that is the visitors coming from the Arab Mashreq and the Turkish Ottoman world, two distinct groups, as we discovered, that is the Arabs and the Turks of the east, who had different attitudes towards the monument. It's precisely a set of attitudes towards the monument that we discover throughout the book. And here, these are not the usual suspects that we are looking at here, not the Orientalist British and French fascination, but we are rather looking at a set of newcomers to the story of the modern Alhambra as we read it here in this book. We are suddenly confronted with, for example, a Spanish Morophile nostalgia. Those Spanish who saw in the Islamic history of their country sort of golden age that Spanish Catholic nationalism put an end to, a form of Spanish melancholic reminiscence of the Muslim past, feeling that has arguably came to slowly disappear in the 20th century. Then, of course, we discover the rich panoply of feelings that the monument provoked for its Muslim visitors. Feelings of pride, sense of achievement, also a sense of loss and dispossession, tears, sadness, sorrow, of course, nostalgia, sort of a longing to an imagined past that the visits here provoke. And sometimes, as we discover, even a sense of anger and a not so shy desire for vengeance sometimes. In that sense, one can argue the book is also built around the history of affects. It's the history of the emotional engagement with a monument. A history that, precisely because it looks at other individuals than the usual Western subjects, reveals a new map of emotions that Alhambra generated. What is more interesting here is that along with this new textured analysis of the emotions Alhambra generated, we also look at the political use and recycling of these feelings. In fact, it's beyond the pathos. The Muslim nostalgia was a fertile ground, and perhaps still is, for some political agenda that sought to capitalize on the emotional potential of Alhambra. We discover here a political diagram that is meshed along with this emotional map that I describe here. This political diagram included, for example, the pan-Islamic agenda of a crumbling Ottoman Empire that wanted to reaffirm its symbolic power over the entire Muslim world. Or in other cases, we look at the place of Alhambra in the modern Arab reformist agenda of al-Nahda that sometimes stood against the Turkish hegemony of that same Ottoman Empire. Christian Maronite actors used Alhambra to sort of secretly promote their allegiance to a modern conquering Christendom. Or even in one case, we discovered the place Alhambra played in the promotion of some sort of a Spanish ecumenical colonialism that promoted a new Muslim and Christian unity, but under the umbrella of a Spanish Catholic kingdom. Alhambra, we learn, is everywhere, and sometimes, as we discovered, in the most unexpected discursive spaces. Now, how did this new reading that Edhem offers of Alhambra emerge? Well, mainly as we were discussing here, thanks to the book's use of a new set of previously untapped sources, evidence that was previously outside of the radar, in the sense of the scholars of the topic. The book looks, in fact, at the notes that visitors left on the visitors' book, the guest book, the French called the livre d'or, golden book. And There is definitely here a methodological originality for sure. We also discover, since we are looking at a quite peculiar genre of writing, that is what is written in a visitor's book. Notes on a guest book are evidently pretty heteroclite. We sometimes have a simple name, a signature, with the long list of pompous titles that 19th century dignitaries like to attribute themselves. We also have often more than that. Some well-articulated impressions, feelings, thoughts, poems about Alhambra in the best cases, and sometimes simply some scribbles and sketches. If the notes on a golden book is a literary genre, it is definitely an understudied genre in art historical discourses, and a category of text that deserves a specific and a delicate form of reading. In fact, the book made me wonder about the odd place of the author in these notes. We discover here that these texts, despite their often political pedigree, they were also strangely personal, intimate, awkwardly sitting almost between a confession and a political plea. The guest book is not the only original source of evidence, of course, that this work uses. The book that we're talking about also looks at the Granadan press of the period, fascinating source as well, which, as we learned, was for a long time very keen on reporting on the visits of Muslim dignitaries to the palace. And that same guest book was also, for the Granadan press, a precious source from which they read what Muslims thought and said about their monument. And I put their monument here, I put the there between brackets, precisely because it's a question of belonging and ownership that was elucidated in this text. Whose monument is this? And reading through this material, we can also detect the sort of gaps, or sort of semiotic gaps between different sources. We realize quickly that what is said is not necessarily what was meant, and that there is also a gap between what the Muslim authors possibly felt and what they decided to write, and another gap between what they wrote and what the Spanish press interpreted these notes to be, and perhaps finally between the Spanish interpretation and our reading of these texts today. Difficult exercise indeed that Edhem, I have to say, navigates beautifully well. I will finish with two simple questions, perhaps. Although it was most probably not an intention, I know that historians do not like to do this, but I could not help but feel the contemporary relevance to the book. As a matter of fact, the lead story first, the story that started this entire project, that if Khalil Jawad al-Khalidi, with that beautiful picture of him in Alhambra that you show us, or it's in one of those studios. Of course, the image of a Palestinian lamenting the loss of a land was quite premonitory in the most gruesome way. The question of land, loss, conquest, and belonging, and the place of Alhambra as the ultimate symbol of such categories continue to exist even after the end of the scope of your book, I imagine. And the question when I was reading it, I enjoyed reading it so much that I was almost sad that it ended in the 1930s. And I was wondering why end at the beginning of the 20th century, a story that continued well after, as I assume. My second question is also linked to that same photo of Khalil Jawad al-Khalidi, and I'm wondering here about your thoughts on the Orientalist critique and perhaps the limits of the Orientalist critique in this context. If we believe, Saeed, that Orientalism is a discourse that is always entangled with power, and more specifically Western imperialism, then one might wonder, was al-Khalidi here self-Orientalizing? Was he, on the contrary, mimicking or appropriating Orientalist means for other ends? or is it simply neither nor? And the Orientalist paradigm overall is not fit actually here to give us a good understanding of this quite intriguing portrait that started this whole project of yours. That would be it. Thank you.
Should I?
Yeah, please.
Okay. Let's start with the last question. I have two photographs of Arabs, real ones, in a photographic studio. One is Khalid Jawad al-Khalidi. The other is Shakib Arslan.
Yes.
And you may have noticed that Shakib Arslan, that's already in 1930, is posing in the same photographer's studio, but in Cordoba, with as the backdrop the forest of trees, the forest of columns. That is the mezquita, the mosque of Cordoba. And you may have noticed that he uses the Orientalist props provided by the studio. There's a little table, Arab table, there's a nargile, there's a shisha, and he himself is wearing a kind of burnous that he doesn't wear normally. I mean, Shakib Arslan is a very modern, he's always in a three-piece suit. And in that photograph, he seems to have played the game all the way. Whereas when you look at Khalid Jawad, he's very, I mean, I may be overreading, but he's very straight, tense even, in that corner of the photographic studio. So my interpretation is that he used it as the only way he had of obtaining a memento of the Alhambra. And this is what he says on the back. This is a photograph taken in a corner of the Alhambra. He's lying, but he's not really lying, right? It's a white lie. But because he wants to say, and I know at least two copies of that photograph. One he sent to Maghreb al-Khalidi, the founder of the Khalidiyya library in Jerusalem in 1905, and this one 1912. So he must have had a stack of these photographs, and the whole point was, I was there, you know, because we're talking about 1904. You can't have yourself photographed inside the Alhambra unless you rent the services of a photographer. So he thought this was a very practical way of leaving a trace of himself in the Alhambra. So I think it's very pragmatic in that sense. I don't think he's self-orientalizing himself. But Shakib Arslan, obviously, but with a tongue-in-cheek attitude, I don't know, because it's really weird. But it's so different, and especially when you put Tunç Hilmi between these two. Tunç Hilmi, this young Turk, posing as a globetrotter or as a Roma, it's a totally different attitude. And when you read his inscription, it's all about, you know, thunderbolts and lightning. Yıldız, that is the palace of Abdülhamid, is going to crumble like the Alhambra crumbled. It's not about the Alhambra, it's about his revolution. So everybody has a different take on this, but the self-orientalizing thing, I think that's Shakib Arslan. Is it because it's already 1930? I really don't know. But it's fascinating, and I have to admit, my major limitation is that I'm a good Ottoman. I don't speak Arabic. I don't read Arabic. So the information I got, I got it through friends. I mean, I'm thankful. At least 10 or 20 colleagues helped me, and I do say it in the book, helped me decipher these comments or whatever. And therefore, I was limited in my capacity to go beyond that into the feelings of these Nahdists, for example. Were they slightly Orientalist too? They might have been. I mean, for obvious reasons. If you believe in modernity, you end up being an Orientalist at some point. It's inevitable. But I don't have a precise answer other than, opposing these two pictures of two Arabs 25 years apart in the same studio, posing very differently.
Just on that, a little note, I talked a little bit about Shakib Arslan in my last book, and he writes this multi-volume history of Al-Andalus that I think is based mostly on European sources, despite the fact that he could read Arabic and read all of the original sources. The framework of the book is much closer to the works of Dozy and Levi Provençal than it is, no, not Levi Provençal, Dozy and
Is it you?
yes, exactly. Than it is Ibn al-Khatib, which is really interesting and suggests that he's trying to articulate in Arabic a claim to the history of European Al-Andalus in a way that is legible to Europeans who work on Al-Andalus, even if he's writing in Arabic, right? His whole framework is in many ways European, even if it is directed toward Pan-Arabism. So to me, it makes perfect sense that he would be dressing like the Europeans dress in the studio of the Alhambra.
I think the Arabs had two different registers, the poetic and the historic. I mean, they're different. And for the poetic, they had access to all the literature of Al-Andalus. When you see Ahmad Zaki, he knows what he's talking about because he is the editor of Safadi and who else? Makari in Egypt in the 1880s. So he's behind this. He knows what he's talking about. But when it comes to history, I wouldn't be surprised, as you say, that they would trust European sources more and that those sources would have been more accessible, understandable, because of the rationality they were in already. So I think, but what I like is the Turks were clueless, and can only depend on Western sources to try to give meaning to the Alhambra. And eventually, I think it's interesting that by the time of Sami Pasha Sezai, because he publishes a little travelogue 15 years later in the late 20s, so in Kemalist times already, his travelogue is half lifted from, again, the Baedeker. I mean, the Baedeker is one of the heroes behind this book. I mean, it's fantastic. And this notion that the Arabs are losers, they're the Bedouins, they couldn't resist to the civilization of the West. And what is implied there is that we, the Turks, are different. So it's already a reference to Anatolia as the source of Turkish identity, very distinct from at the end of the 19th century. For a brief period, you see that the Ottomans are looking at Al-Andalus as with some kind of nostalgia, but it's a very mixed nostalgia because they are also obsessed with, in the 1870s, losing territories in Europe. So the parallel is kind of obvious. So to the Ottomans, more than the glory, it's decay and loss. It's failure that seems to characterize the Alhambra and Andalusia in general.
Did you get an answer to your first question? Do you want to go back to
sorry.
your first question?
Remind me.
Yes.
Oh, why I stopped in 1930? Because my world ends in 1913.
Yeah, that's right.
Kind of. I mean,
That's right.
even going into the 1920s was exceptional. But I could not do without Yahya Kemal and his poem of castanets and whatever. It was too tempting. But I mean, in terms of the documentation, I was most comfortable with a period that I'm familiar with. And I think things changed radically after World War I. It's another world. It's another world. So I'm sure, because I mean, you have another dimension, which is that of Frankism. I mean, there is a Frankist or Francoist Orientalization of the Alhambra from the 1930s on, which is, I think, very interesting. But my God, no, I couldn't go into that. So I had to stick to the long 19th century. I mean, I visited the Alhambra with my parents in 1970. So, I mean, I could have even found my father's or my mother's signature there. But as I said, they're not accessible after the 1940s for whatever reason. But no, I decided to stop there. Plus, there's good work that has been done by Nieves Paradela on the big names of the Nahda well into the 1930s. So I didn't want to redo that. I benefited a lot from her work, but I was more interested in, what you said, the more modest, the unknown individuals. And unknown. I mean, somebody who has the means of traveling to Spain is by definition, we're not talking about the Anatolian peasant or the Egyptian fellah, but still, you have individuals who are much more obscure, and that adds, I think, power to the impact of the Alhambra and Andalusia on me. Of course, I mean, if the Mezquita, if the Mosque of Cordoba had a book of visitors, I think that would have been fantastic. I don't think there's any other monument that has this kind of a, the Parthenon, the Acropolis doesn't. It's a fascinating source.
If I may ask a question about the building, the Alhambra, which has, it's built and starting in the late 12th century and then completely rebuilt in the 14th, and then it has this major period of reconstruction in exactly the period that you're writing about, largely at the hands of the Contreras brothers, who you talk a little bit about. And I believe, though I was not able to find confirmation, that photo studio was also constructed by the Contreras brothers. So in some ways, I mean, like radical reconstruction. So in this period, as it moves from a ruin, a romantic ruin, to this glorious palace, there's also a physical change to the building, which is filling in all of the blank parts of the walls where the stucco has been damaged or has fallen off. And that's how we end up with the monument that we have today, where every wall is pristine. But much of that is 19th century.
Yes.
So it's this really interesting parallel to the transformation of the meanings of the Alhambra that you write about. And I wondered if you could reflect a little bit.
Okay.
On that.
One thing I'm not is architectural historian, so but I do dabble with that, especially in the context of the use of the Mashreq in Istanbul, and I counter the argument that this was a conscious revivalist thing. I don't believe that.
Yeah.
So that's another question. But the Contreras, they really, and they were selling stucco parts of the Alhambra. So I would imagine that would have been the inspiration for Garzon's studio. I've tried as best I can to understand where the little window came from. It came from the Tower of the Maidens or whatever, so it's a collage, pretty much. But what is very interesting, for example, in the interventions, one of the interventions of the Contreras brothers, or one of the Contreras, is that in the Patio de los Leones, the courtyard of the lions, the two templetes, the two pavilions at the far end, had a conical, a very Maghreb kind of thing, and they were Persianized with onion bowl things by the Contreras brothers, which of course goes in the direction of this desire to exoticize, orientalize. So I think what is most fascinating is to see that, the Orient is in the eye of the beholder. I mean, basically, everybody has his or her vision of a certain Orient, of a certain way in which they want to represent not only the Alhambra, but Andalusia and even Spain. And I think one of the things I'm kind of proud of is that I've brought back Spain into the debate, because one of the problems is I think that the Owen Jones thing kind of marginalizes Spain, forgetting, for example, that the first serious work on the restitution of the Alhambra was made in the 18th century by a Spanish team, and that they were very present, and you see them in the books, in the press. And I think that's fascinating, because the Spaniards are a little bit like the Turks, in the sense that they're in between. They are Orientalized by the Northerners, but they have their Orient, and their Orient is Africa. And they're trying to use that in order to promote the vision of Andalusia as an intimate knowledge of an Africa that they could dominate, in competition, of course, with the French and the British. So that, I think, is really very interesting, and so absent from most of the literature, which looks at the Alhambra as an Owen-esque and Irving-esque kind of adventure. What I found fascinating was the book by Julián Ruderías in 1914 about the Black Legend, La Leyenda Negra, which is this very Spanish notion that ever since the 16th century and the growth of Spain in America, the rest, that is the North, has been against Spain and has been basically assassinating Spain's character, all the massacres of the American Indians, and that this Orientalism is something that Julián Ruderías, who's a young writer in 1914, uses pretty much in the same way as Turkey today uses of half-digested Saidian Orientalism to counter anything that the West says. Like, it's crypto-nationalism. If the West said something, Said told us it's wrong, which is not what Said says. It's very different, and therefore the reverse is true. It's exactly the same with a century of difference, and it's a reaction to everything that they see, the commercialization of the image of Al-Andalus in the Paris Exposition in 1900, which is amazing. I mean, it's really, so I think bringing back Spain into the picture to me was extremely important, because of its very ambiguous stand as both victim and perpetrator, if you want, of Orientalism. But I mean, for architectural history, that's pretty much all. I know the story of the Templetes, but that's
no, absolutely.
Really,
It strikes me as so parallel to the story that you're telling.
Yeah.
In a really interesting way, and also the diffusion of Alhambresque as an international style is in part due to them sending these plaster models and maquettes to design schools all across the world. So it reinforces your argument. It's the same narrative. I wanted to ask also about the question of the Moor, because sometimes in the sources that you're looking at, they are described as an extinct group. There were these people, they were called the Moors. They came to Spain and they created this great civilization, and then they fell and they no longer exist. And sometimes the Moor is a synonym for Moroccans. And it's like, oh, these Moroccans are all descendants of the people who ruled Al-Andalus, and there's no daylight between these two categories. And I wondered if you could talk a bit about that category, because I noticed that you, when you were speaking, sometimes used Moor because your sources sometimes use Moor, and other times you didn't. You talked about Arabs or Muslims or Spaniards.
No. I mean, I think it's very complex. I mean, how do you define the Alhambra? Is it an Islamic monument? Is it an Arab monument? Is it a Moorish monument? I mean, the Moor obviously is a very loaded word that is difficult to use, but it's so present, especially when you use Spanish sources. It's moro. It's constantly moros. And in the 19th century, the French also, it's very present in representations of those people. And, the way in which when Paris exhibits Andalusia in the time of the Moors, they will pick women from Algiers to dance, exhibit Moorish identity, because it's all the same to them, And this is something that, in a way, Spanish colonialism reinforces by saying, yes, we are the heirs, but we're the proud heirs who are going to reconquer and re-civilize that part of the. So it's a very complex thing, and also, I don't know if I have these obsessive compulsive things of counting beads and counting words and whatever. So I did, there's this guidebook, which is the Bible of English-speaking travelers everywhere, but to Spain, Fords. And I counted, and that's the beauty of PDF for you, you can count words, things you couldn't do in the past. I've counted all the ethnic or religious terms as they occur in that guidebook of Spain. So Moor, Oriental, even Turk, what else? Arab, Muslim. It's incredible to see to what extent they're interchangeable. They're interchangeable, and I tried to show even that some of the stereotypes that are associated with the Moorish character draw on Orientalism directed at the Turks. So they're lazy like Turks. They're whatever, it's this incredible. Africa is less present. Interestingly, it's Théophile Gautier who comes out, Spain is Africa. And that's, but these are so interchangeable. And then, of course, you have the Turks who are clueless again. And it's weird because they cannot translate some of the terms. Moor doesn't make sense. So they use Arab or Urban or whatever, but they lose the variety of words that are used, even the Mauresque. One of the points is that when there's this Mauresque craze in Istanbul in the 1860s, I haven't found one single reference in the Turkish-speaking press to the style of these buildings, except being beautiful or whatever, but never do you have. The only one is the entrance now to Istanbul University, to the Ministry of War, which is described Arab usul, in Arab style. But it's the only one in over 10 years in the press. So these terms are very, very tricky, and difficult to handle, because, what are you, but yeah, the Moor is omnipresent. But I don't think, that's something I can't really say. In the Arab literature, for example, in the Nahda, I don't think Moor will appear. And of course, the other absent is the Amazigh, the Berber. The Berber is not there. The Berber is completely marginalized, both by the West and even more by the Nahda and the Arab literature. So when we know that they were extremely present, so it's really a mess. But it's a fascinating mess.
This is such an engaging conversation, and I'm sorry to step in as the moderator, but we only have 10 more minutes. So if you don't mind, I really would like to take some questions from our audience. I'm sure there will be questions.
Thank you. Speaking of words, I was curious about, because you gave the example of somebody, I forgot his name, who described himself as flaneur parisien, and
Victor Place, yeah.
And did Ottomans describe themselves as something, as tourists, as traveler, as white?
He did. Visually, He did by posing as a globetrotter. I mean, the only thing Turkish about him is the fez, right? The rest is really the outfit of a traveler. And he is very interesting because he has a travelogue. It's a very political travelogue. It's called Rezalet, or Scandal. And it is about his exile or his compromission with Abdul Hamid when he accepts this position in Madrid. And if you read this travelogue, which is very funny, very tongue-in-cheek, it's a combination of good old information that he gets, of course, from the Baedeker, and says so, but also his political aims and his take on modernity. His take on modernity. He says, for example, and that's quite exceptional, when he goes to Portugal, he has a second volume, Rezalet Portuguiste, and he says, I visited the Cathedral of Lisbon, and it's a former mosque that was turned into a cathedral. How funny that at the two ends of the Mediterranean, you have one mosque that was turned into, and one cathedral that was turned into a mosque, referring to the Hagia Sophia, and criticizing both for being barbaric ways of, playing. So very modern, very engaged. But otherwise, yes, I mean, when you see Ali Kemal traveling with Princess Zeynep, of all people, the Egyptian princess, and Sherife, her stepdaughter. I mean, their attitude is that of a very bourgeois, in fact, aristocratic group of travelers. But then again, you don't get this, I'm a traveler, I'm a flaneur, or whatever. You get this sense, but not explicitly. But the flaneur, that's a good one.
Other questions?
I have a question, but this might be not on the scope. It's still I want to ask. So this thing with Ottomans and with all the people kind of accelerates after the transformation of the hub that I would call, because it's somehow a cultural one, also a touristic one. So it holds a significance for all the people involved and for the local people too. There's a photographer there, so it means they make money out of it. So I want to ask the economic aspect, and especially your opinion that whether the Alhambra is the one that started it, the economic sphere or the relations that has been formed around it, or the economic relations were formed and they put the Alhambra as the symbol.
As they say when they don't know what to say, that's an excellent question. I don't know. I mean, obviously, there's no basis for comparison. I haven't been into, I don't think the Alhambra has some kind of an administrative archive, financial archive of its revenues. For early times, I don't even know if people paid. But when you look at the guidebooks at the end of the 19th or beginning of the 20th century, you get a sense of an economy. You even have the price of having your photo taken in the Alhambra, which is 1 peseta or 2 pesetas. From there, can you derive an economic model? I don't know. I don't know. I don't know how, for example, the administration of the Alhambra used its revenues. Did they use them for restoration, reparation? This is something that Spanish historians of the monument maybe have done, and I haven't seen, but I don't know of anything on that. But what is clear is that you have when it comes to especially Americans, Brits, Frenchmen, Germans, it's a very high bourgeois and even aristocratic profile. I mean, these are people who come with their yachts to Almeria or to Malaga and then go to, so it's, and they're parties. I mean, the thing I showed in 1845 of people waltzing and dancing the polka in the Alhambra, it's disturbingly entitled in a sense. And there's a comment there. There's a comment by somebody who saw that, was disgusted and said, "What do you?" So but it's a very, very high level kind of tourism, which becomes a little more democratized by the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. But to really understand that, one will have to do more than just cherry pick the odd Arabs and Turks and whatever, and look at it systematically, which is an enormous work because you're talking about volumes and volumes of stuff. So, yeah.
You mentioned Khalil Jawad al-Khalili wrote a poem in the logbook. And I'm sort of just curious about poetry as a mode of expression for the engagement between Muslims and Alhambra, and I guess as a mode of expression at large for Al-Andalus. So I sort of want to, just know your response about the usage of poetry or these type of sort of ornate responses as a mode of expression, and I guess maybe if you like how that might fit with your Orientalist framework, if you want to sort of, or if you feel like it does fit within an Orientalist framework.
Okay. Now, what's interesting about these poems is that you see them repeated in different volumes. And different volumes means that somebody writing in one volume would probably not have seen the preceding volume. It's not like, you got access to all the volumes. They once it was finished, they're yearly or whatever, they lift them. So in the case of Khalil Jawad's poem, what's interesting is that he's got a different poem on the back of the photograph and a different one in the visitor's book. And the one he has on the back of the photograph is something that is identical to what Ahmad Zaki, who visits in 1893, has written in his own travelogue. So that proves, I think, that Khalidi was traveling with Zaki's travelogue. Very different from the Ottomans with the Baedeker, right? But what's interesting is that both these poems have a genealogy that goes back to the 10th and 11th centuries, and they both have an expression of despair. Alhambra, wukuftu, and I was standing there, and the other one is about crying, whatever. And both were written not for the Alhambra, but for Madinat al-Zahra, which is the palatial complex in Cordoba. And of course, Alhambra, al-Zahra, it's the same prosody. You can use them interchangeably. So somebody at some point, maybe Ahmad Zaki, used that trick to adapt this to the needs of the Alhambra. So I've reconstructed the genealogy of these, and I have them being handed down through Safadi, through Makkari, through all sorts of authors, but I can't put a smoking gun in Khariji's hand, except for one of the poems, because it's in Ahmad Zaki's thing. But when the same poem appears 10 years earlier in the inscription left by a Moroccan secretary, there I have to decide that this was not a written, but an oral memory. I think that these are kind of, little bits and pieces of poetry that people memorized, that circulated, and that therefore that were handed down without necessarily a direct connection between a Maghrebi and a Mashreqi in very different contexts. So I think it's I don't think the variety is enormous. I think these people functioned with a very limited number of poems. The citation, the Shakespeare citation that everybody knows, or, which doesn't mean that you know all Shakespeare, you just know that. To be or not to be, everybody knows it, right? It's a bit like that, I think. But then again, one of my greatest frustrations is that I haven't been able to penetrate the Maghrebi world. I mean, I have the Nahda people have left travelogues. The Turks have their travelogues. There's the press. The Granada press is there. The Maghreb, Morocco, is a terra incognita. And I hope that some Moroccan scholars or young PhD candidates might go into possible rihlas, or because the only rihlas we have are from the 17th and 18th centuries. There are 3 of them. They've been published by Nabil Matar and whatever, they're well known. But these are people, we're talking about 200 people or 150 people who visited Granada in half a century. The press, I don't know anything. I haven't had access to the Moroccan press. And even if I had access, I wouldn't have been able to make much of it. So I think there's something there that needs to be exploited and that might be very interesting because of the proximity, as I said, cultural, geographic. I mean, these people were constantly traveling back and forth. But that's not an answer to the poetry thing. But for the poetry, that's what I thought, yes.
Well, please join me in giving a round of applause to our speakers today.